On May 1st, 1943, I was promoted to Captain First Rank. The commander of the Shiga Captain Third Rank Kimio Yamagami gave a reception in my honor on this occasion. The officers gathered in the wardroom to congratulate me and drink sake on the occasion. We drank a couple of cups of sake each, after which the destroyer commander said in a somewhat uncertain voice, "For the past 40 days, the crew has been working hard without any rest. Today, the Akashi Floating Workshop is showing a movie in the evening. Should we let the sailors go there?" It's always difficult to refuse such requests, but I did. I know you've all been working hard without rest, but it's not my whim, it's necessity. It is also a necessity that we must not waste any more time. Yamagami was silent, but the commander of the Mine and Torpedo Warfare Unit, Lieutenant Commander Doi, tried to contradict me. "Mr. Captain First Rank, forgive me if I seem impertinent, but I don't understand why the sailors can't have a little fun and rest. Not saying they deserve it, a little respite will only inspire them to train even harder." Doi replied, "I may seem overly harsh if I remind you that the crew of a destroyer has never been in a battle where the slightest mistake can lead to the death of the ship and the entire crew. Let them scold me now for ruthless training, but I want at least you officers to realize that it is better to work hard now than to be killed by the enemy." The brief tense silence was interrupted by the senior mechanic, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Kayanama. "Gentlemen," he said, "I share Captain First Rank Hara's opinion. Many of our destroyers have been lost in recent months right in front of Captain First Rank Hara's eyes. We should be happy to have a division commander with so much combat experience. Many will later realize how much they owe to his combat experience." We drank the third cup, and the reception in my honor ended. Everyone went to their battle stations. After 6 weeks of training, the Siga was assigned to patrol duty in the Truk area. This service included escorting transports and searching for enemy submarines, providing an excellent opportunity to continue training. Meanwhile, the overall military situation was getting worse. The enemy's offensive capabilities were growing much faster than those of our defenses. Admiral Mainichi Koga, who succeeded the late Admiral Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, continued the tactics of his predecessor. Light boats and destroyers were thrown into battle piecemeal, becoming a kind of expendable material of naval warfare. They still managed to win localized victories, but they were unable to change the course of the war. After the withdrawal from Guadalcanal, the front line of Japanese defense passed through a group of islands of New Georgia. On the main island of the Munda Archipelago were our main bases. Troops were also deployed on the nearby island of Kolombangara. In total, there were about 10,500 of our soldiers on the archipelago. On June 30th, 1943, the Americans began landing on the northern tip of the islands of Rendova and Wangunu, also part of the New Georgia Island group. The enemy landings posed an immediate threat to our bases, and Admiral Koga ordered that the garrison of the islands be reinforced with troops and weapons. The destroyers were again used as fast transports of the old Tokyo Express, carrying huge amounts of men and cargo. The destroyers engaged in fierce battles with numerically superior enemy forces, which by this time had more advanced detection systems and weapons. Such skirmishes took place almost continuously on July 4th, 6, 12, and 19. Especially brilliant were the actions of 5 of our destroyers in Kuda Bay on July 12th, reminiscent of the former glory of the battles at Guadalcanal. In this battle, the Japanese unit consisted of the light cruiser Jintsu and destroyers Yukikaze, Hamakaze, Ayanami, and Yuga. They had to deal with a strong enemy force of 2 American and 1 New Zealand cruisers and 10 destroyers. The battle began around midnight, when the cruiser Jintsu, repeating the mistake of the battleship Haie, opened searchlights and was sunk by concentrated artillery of the enemy. In the battle that broke out, the New Zealand cruiser Linda was immediately torpedoed and went out of action. The Allies made a major blunder by dividing their forces into 2 groups, One of these groups, consisting of 4 destroyers, failed to attack a single Japanese ship. 5 of our destroyers, carrying full speed in total darkness and boldly maneuvering, torpedoed the cruiser Saint and Honolulu, putting them out of action, and sank the destroyer Gwain. In the turmoil collided American destroyers Woodworth and Buchanan, causing each other serious damage. The Japanese destroyers, however, returned to base in triumph. However, the loss of the cruiser Jintsu was a heavier loss for us than for the Americans' temporarily out of action 3 cruisers. I listened to the account of the exploits of the Yukikaze with some envy. When at the end of 1942 we had to act together, my Amatsukaze did not really stand out against his background. Now the Yukikaze was a standout ship. He became the only destroyer that did not get even a scratch in the Bismarck Sea, and brilliantly showed himself in the battle in Kula Bay. Envy me, however, was not long. On July 20th, Sigga received orders to proceed to Rabaul. Having loaded on board crates with spare parts for airplanes, we left for Rabaul, following a southerly course at a speed of 18 knots. The voyage was uneventful, and we arrived at Rabaul on July 23rd. Having anchored, I went at once to the headquarters of the connection. After listening to me, the officer on duty silently handed me a piece of paper. I quickly ran it through my eyes and became numb. July 20th, destroyers Yuga and Kianami were sunk south of Choiseul. It happened while they were escorting transports to Kolombangara. The ships were lost with their entire crew, 228 men on the Yuga and 240 on the Kianami. In just a week, the enemy had avenged their losses in Kula Bay. The 27th Destroyer Division still existed purely nominally. After a brief rest and familiarization with the situation, I was sent with 3 destroyers of the 4th Division to bring supplies to Kolombangara. We were to proceed through Vela Bay, which headquarters considered a reasonably safe route. Mindful of the success of the previous raid by Ariake and 2 of his mates, I did not share this optimism, for I had already had many instances of seeing that the repetition of the same tactical scheme always leads to the most unfortunate results. We could not hope that the enemy would still, out of courtesy to us, waste time and fuel in Kula Bay without finding out why it was empty. For some reason, the headquarters persistently considered the Americans fools, and a huge number of bitter examples did not go to the command in favor. August 1st, we left Rabaul, following the keel column led by the destroyer Amagiri. As the lead ship, which carried out a forward watch, Amagiri did not carry any cargo. But the following destroyers Hagikaze, Arashi and Shiga had 900 soldiers and 120 tons of cargo on board. This was the first combat operation of 1943 in which I participated. In my absence, in the battles of the Central Solomon Islands, many of the famous veteran destroyers of Admiral Tanaka's battle group were lost to mines or airstrikes. Enveloped in these memories, I stood on the bridge of the Shiga, looking at the darkening sky and thinking about which of our 4 destroyers are destined to survive in this campaign. An impenetrably dark night descended, creating hope for good fortune. We entered Blackett Strait, a narrow strip of water separating Kolombangara from the 3 islets to the southwest. Both sides of this narrow strait teemed with dangerous reefs and banks for several miles. On reaching the agreed place, we stalled the cars and lay adrift. At the same minute, dozens of barges and pontoons came from the shore to receive our cargo. Everything was done quickly, organized and without the slightest noise. Literally in 20 minutes from the destroyers were removed all the people and cargo. It was with great relief that I read the light signal from the Hagikaz, "Let's go home." Within 5 minutes we turned around in this treacherous narrowness and headed back. The enemy, who had an extensive intelligence network here, could suddenly appear from any cove, of which there were many along the coast, covered by reefs and shoals that resembled a deadly maze. Turning back on our course, we were going at a speed of 30 knots within 10 minutes, which was sheer madness in such dangerous waters. In peacetime, no ship would dare to sail here at night at a speed of more than 12 knots, even if all the navigation lights were on. We were sailing, of course, in total darkness. The distance between the ships was no more than 500 meters. Suddenly I noticed a small dark object moving quickly towards the Amagiri, which was 1,500 meters ahead of us. What kind of object it was, I could not determine, but I transmitted an alarm signal and all squeezed in anticipation of an explosion. The black object melted into the darkness without any explosion, flash or fire. I was puzzled. At that moment the Amagiri transmitted by signal lamp, attacked by enemy torpedo boats. One rammed and sunk. Suddenly, large-caliber machine guns from Hagikazi and Arashi barked. I saw tracers flying from the starboard side of the destroyers. Also suddenly, the darkness of the night was illuminated by two blossoms of raging flame. It was burning two torpedo boats of the enemy. I had no sooner given the order to open fire than the burning boat disappeared, as if it had never existed. We kept going in the dark. The mood had lifted. Jokes and laughter could be heard on deck. I was well aware of how lucky we were, and how close we were to death. I still remembered well how American torpedo boats had sunk the USS Terutsuki in December 1942. It was the newest Japanese destroyer with a displacement of 3,470 tons, and it was sunk by a tiny boat with a displacement of only 50 tons. The same fate awaited us if the enemy had been able to detect us a few minutes earlier. After leaving Vela Bay, we increased our speed and returned to Rabaul without further incident. The whole crew was still in an excited and cheerful mood because of the night's skirmish with the enemy. I, on the other hand, had no reason to be cheerful. When I came to headquarters with my report, I was handed another secret message. Destroyers Mikatsuki and Ariake, while transporting cargo to Tuluva on the archipelago of New Britain July 27th, ran aground near Cape Gloucester. The next day they were attacked by B-25 bombers and completely destroyed. 7 men were killed. I was again the commander of a one-ship division. How quickly the forces of our fleet are melting. From the glorious July quintet remained only 2 ships. And it's only been a month. How could these destroyers run aground together? Frustrated and devastated, I locked myself in my quarters at night and drank several bottles of sake. Then Captain 3rd Rank Yamagami joined me, and for about an hour and a half we drowned our despondency in vodka together. Then he left and I continued to drink alone until I completely passed out. 2 days later, on the morning of August 4th, the commander of the 4th Destroyer Division, Captain 1st Rank Kazu Sujira, invited Yamagami and me to his office for a meeting. It was a beautiful sunny day, and we travelled by boat to the destroyer Hagikaze. The table and chairs for the meeting were brought directly to the upper deck, under a small awning. We were the last to arrive, catching all the other commanders and their XRs on the Hagikaze. Captain Sujira was a few years older than me, but unlike me, he had graduated from the Naval Academy. "Gentlemen," he said, opening the conference, "I am pleased to report to you that our last transport raid on Kolombangara was a complete success. Our naval commanders, as well as the army commanders, have expressed their pleasure at the conduct of this operation and have authorized me to declare their gratitude to you all. In addition, orders have been received to repeat a similar raid the day after tomorrow. The same ships will go. Only the Kawakaze will replace the Amagiri, whose bow was damaged by a torpedo boat ramming. I'll be glad to hear your opinions and suggestions." Looking at the faces of those present, I realized that there would be no suggestions from the destroyer commanders of the 4th Division. On their faces I could read only unquestioning obedience to whatever their division commander said. Since I was the only one of those present of equal rank and position with Captain Sujira, I was probably the first to respond to his proposal. "Mr. Sujira," I said, "if I understand correctly, we are to repeat our night trek. Does that mean we must conduct the next operation in the same pattern as the previous one?" "Exactly so," Hara Sujira replied. "We should pass through Vela Bay. then through Blackett Strait and unload at the Kolombangara anchorage at 23:30 hours, just like last time. I beg your pardon, Mr. Sujira, I objected, but I don't think it's quite wise to repeat the same operational pattern again. This procedure has already been used twice in Velebay, hasn't it? Isn't there any way to change it this time? Say, for example, before entering Blackett Strait, take a false course through Guyzot Strait, or at least change the time schedule of the operation. Hara, replied the 4th Division Commander, I understand and share your concern, but the order has already been given. If you change any detail in it, it will entail big changes in all its components, especially in everything related to communications. Do you know what kind of prehistoric communication systems the army garrisons have? On the other hand, if Blackett Strait with its reefs and shoals is dangerous to us, it is equally dangerous to the enemy. Their gunboats might, without detecting us, pop up on the rocks. The 3 commanders from Sujira's division nodded in loyal agreement. I realized that any of my suggestions would not win the approval of anyone except Yamagami. Meanwhile, Sujira continued in a conciliatory tone. I think you will agree with me, Hara. If I put your Shiga in charge, relieve you of the cargo, thus giving you complete freedom of hands. With your experience and skill, you will provide excellent protection for the entire squadron. It was, of course, a clever move. In fact, I, the only officer who dared to show dissatisfaction with the order, was responsible for the entire operation. The eyes of all present looked at me, waiting for a reaction to this proposal. I understand your reasoning, Mr. Sujira, I replied, but I cannot accept your proposal. To say that the commanders present were surprised by my response is to say nothing. They were simply stunned. I continued. Siga is the oldest of the 4 destroyers. His machine has long been in need of repair, and I doubt that he can reach a speed of even 30 knots. It is completely unsuitable for forward patrol. I recommend that Capt. 2nd rank Koshichi Sugioka be assigned to the forward watch. His newest destroyer, the Arashi, can easily reach 35 knots. Captain 1st rank Sujira shook off his expression of displeasure and looked at Captain 2nd rank Sugioka in silence. The latter averted his eyes without saying anything. Sujira sighed and summarized the meeting. All right, gentlemen, he said. My Hagikaze will lead the squad. He will be the forward guard, but will take on board his share of men and cargo. It will be followed by Arashi, Kawakaze, and at the end, Shiga at a distance of 500 meters from each other. This will create a compact but maneuverable formation. Does that satisfy you, Hara? I paid tribute to his stamina and patience and agreed. In the end, all these details were of little importance against the backdrop of the expediency of the entire operation. Next, the meeting began to discuss the overall tactical plan. According to this plan, we were to leave Rabaul at dawn in order to arrive in the area where the reconnaissance aircraft of the enemy, with the onset of darkness. Sujira believed that American reconnaissance planes based on Russell Island were capable of operating within 300 miles of their base. It is possible that a week ago his assumptions might have been considered perfectly correct. But we were obliged to consider the possibility that the American reconnaissance aircraft might well now operate from more advanced bases. Say from Rendova, where the enemy has settled since early July. In addition, our detachment could be detected and enemy submarines, and this possibility was not considered at the meeting. I did not say another word, sitting in gloomy thoughtfulness. Remembering that meeting, I still cannot suppress a feeling of deep regret. After all, I thought, I had not done all I could to prove my views right. Had I been able to do so, how many lives would have been saved in this operation and in many others to come? And although reason tells me that with such a rigid hierarchy that existed in our Navy, I could hardly achieve anything, nevertheless I blame myself for the lack of effort. On August 6th, about 3 a.m., we left Rabaul, taking a course to the south. The sea was calm. The sun sometimes peeped through the rain clouds. At times it rained. We were passing Buka Island when an enemy airplane was seen going into the clouds. Our radio operators intercepted a long encrypted message about the plane, marked urgent apparently. It was a report of our sighting. We could no longer count on surprise. I looked at the flagship Hagikaze, waiting to see how Captain Sujira would react to such a development. But nothing happened. The squadron continued on the same course, and at the same speed. All I could do was clench my teeth and pray that it would pass. At 19 we entered the Strait of Bougainville, where we turned 140 degrees with a speed of 30 knots. 2 hours and 20 minutes later the detachment was northeast of Vella La Vella Island. My Sigga was slightly behind the detachment as the 30-knot speed was too much for it. Lieutenant Yoshio Yukihara, the navigator, reported to me that the distance to our forward Matlot Kawakaze had increased to 1,000 meters instead of the prescribed 500 meters. He suggested we force the engines to shorten the distance, but I did not authorize it. We'll stay at 1,000 meters. On the starboard side we passed Kolumbangara, with the volcano peak overhanging the whole area, ominously sticking out against the black clouds. To the left there was nothing but darkness, from which anything could be expected at any moment. A chill ran through me. I gave the order to aim all guns and torpedo apparatus on the port side, setting the sights at a distance of 3,000 meters, and torpedoes at a depth of 2 meters with a solution of 20 degrees. Also double the number of signalmen. For the next 10 minutes I stared intensely into the darkness, hoping that some flickering shadow would reveal the presence of the enemy. The silence was interrupted by a shout from Yamashita's signalman. I see storms. Black objects. Several ships coming straight at us. Putting the rudder to starboard, I ordered torpedoes to be fired at the targets appearing off the port side. Their bow booms were already clearly visible. With horror, I looked at the 3 destroyers of our squadron ahead. They continued on a straight course, blindly approaching the enemy ships. My Sigga was now 1,500 meters from the Kawakaze, turning sharply to the right and firing torpedoes one after another. It was 21:45. We were preparing to fire the 8th torpedo when I noticed, just 800 meters from the destroyer, an ominous black trail heading in our direction. I again commanded starboard, and at that moment I saw a pillar of fire rise right in the middle of the Arashi destroyer, and a moment later 2 pillars of fire rose above the Kawakaze. Our flagship Hagikaze, which had flown off the Arashi, was not visible to me. As I looked at the surface of the water, I felt my breath catching. 3 torpedoes were heading straight for the bow of the Shiga, which was turning agonizingly slowly to the right. I felt weak in my knees and clung to the bridge rail. The first torpedo passed 20 meters off our bow, the second even closer. As for the third, it seemed that it would certainly hit us. Fortunately, it did not happen. Literally stripped the paint from our bow, the torpedo passed by thanks to a sharp turn, which was made by the destroyer. No sooner had we completed the turn than I saw several more torpedoes coming at my destroyer. I ordered the rudder to be put to port to starboard. When a destroyer is racing at 30 knots, it takes almost half a minute before she obeys a turn of the helm. I looked around anxiously. Fortunately, there were no more torpedoes. I glanced at my watch again, 21:47. Those 2 minutes were perhaps the most terrifying of my life. At that moment, signalman Yamashita jubilantly announced that one of our torpedoes had hit an enemy ship. He himself had seen the explosion among the American destroyers. This news was a good release for my sailors, who during our desperate maneuvering were in the terrible tension of waiting for the explosion of their own ship. However, the shouts of joy were quickly silenced when it became apparent that none of the enemy ships had been hit. It was later learned that the torpedo explosion that Yamashita had observed had come from the keelboat jet of an American destroyer. Our oxygen torpedoes were so sensitive that they often exploded when hit by the jet from the propellers. The American ships received no hits in this battle. The enemy performed admirably, making no mistakes, consisting of the 12th Destroyer Division and the 15th Destroyer Division. Some of my torpedoes should have hit the target accurately, but the enemy destroyers in time made a 90-degree turn to the east and evaded them. I asked the radio operators what I heard from the other 3 destroyers. From the radio room reported that Arashi and Kawakaze transmitted a short message about getting hit by torpedoes. There was nothing from the Hagakaz. A quick assessment of the situation convinced me that the enemy had brilliantly succeeded in luring us into an ambush, and that the Shiga was now at the greatest disadvantage imaginable. I remembered the night battle off Guadalcanal, when my destroyer single-handedly attacked a column of enemy ships and sank the USS Barton. Now the roles were reversed. The enemy attacked me, not acting alone. Judging by the number of torpedoes fired, we are from the darkness collapsed several enemy ships. I did not expect from the Americans such sniper torpedo shooting in total darkness. Apparently, the experience of past battles with us taught them a lot. I, of course, could not leave my comrades in distress, but at the same time I could do little against such a superior enemy force. But since there were no reports from the Hagakaz, we could assume that the flagship destroyer was still intact. Then we should try to make contact with it. I ordered the torpedo tubes to be reloaded and announced that we were returning to the battle site. It was 21:51 when the Shiga finished turning to reverse course. A minute later, a huge sheaf of flame cut through the night darkness right on course, about 3 miles ahead of us. I tried desperately to contact our ships by radio. No one was answering. At that moment in the night sky hung a garland of flares and sparkling incendiary shell trails. The enemy was killing our ships with artillery. Even when we were turning back, I felt that Shiga somehow insecurely reacts to the shift of the rudder. Even at the very beginning of the battle I felt some kind of blow to the stern, but I was not sure of it. Only 4 months later, when Shiga was put in the dock, we found a hole in the rudder pepper almost 2 feet in diameter. An American torpedo had gone right through the rudder feather, but fortunately had not exploded. Clinging to the bridge rail, I feverishly considered my next course of action. The deck of the destroyer was crammed with cargo, and the whole ship was crammed with soldiers, of whom there were 250. It was impossible to fight effectively under such conditions with a superior enemy. At Guadalcanal I made 3 mistakes, and it cost me 43 men of the crew. How much will the mistakes I make today cost me? Shiga was still moving toward the battle site when at 10:10 p.m. the artillery fire suddenly ceased. Everything was once again plunged into pitch blackness. I was sure that 3 of our destroyers were sunk. The enemy must be hiding in the darkness, waiting for the moment to attack the lone Shiga. At 22:15, receiving no response on the radio and seeing no one around, I gave the order to withdraw from the scene of battle. Thus this battle, later called the Battle of Vela Bay, ended in a complete American victory. 3 Japanese destroyers were sunk. Of their 700 crewmen and 820 soldiers on board, only 310 survived. Among the survivors was Captain First Rank Sugiura. It took him about 30 hours to reach the shore, and then he spent a week wandering in the jungle until he was discovered by a rescue party. When an exhausted and sullen Sugiura returned to Rabaul on August 20th, it pained me to look at him. The survivors of the lost destroyers admitted that they noticed the torpedoes coming at them when they were already about 300 meters from the ships. 2 torpedoes hit the Hagakaz, immediately disabling the destroyer's radio station. Arashi was hit by 3 torpedoes, Kawakaze by 2. It was one of the most successful torpedo attacks in history. The 8th American torpedo hit, as already mentioned, the Shiga's rudder feather. Had it exploded, the Shiga would have shared the fate of the other 3 destroyers of the 4th Division. After the war, I learned additional details about this battle. The enemy had learned of our withdrawal as early as the morning of that day and constantly tracked the movement of our detachment to the entrance to Vela Bay. At 0930 hours, 6 American destroyers left Tulagi. Upon entering the bay, the Americans used radar to locate our detachment at a distance of about 10 miles. The enemy compound then divided into 2 groups of 3 destroyers each. The groups were to go into torpedo attack alternately, but the first group achieved so many hits that the second was left only to finish our damaged ship's artillery. After this battle at Rabaul, the superiors finally realized that it was impossible to supply Kolombangara through Vela Bay. Late on the night of August 7th, the Sigga returned to Rabaul. A panic-like atmosphere prevailed at headquarters. The loss of Munda Island the previous day, April 4th, and then the unprecedented defeat of our destroyer detachment plunged everyone into a state of shock. The main bastion of Japanese defense in the Solomon Islands was separated from Munda only a narrow strip of water of Blackett Strait. I reported the disaster to the commander of the 8th Fleet, Vice Admiral Samedzima. He listened to me with a grim face, but did not condemn my actions with a word. Admiral realized his own responsibility for the fact that the 4th Destroyer Division was sent into a trap because of the stupid tradition of time after time to use the same tactics. Upon arrival at the base, we unloaded 250 soldiers and their cargo ashore. Most of the soldiers could barely stand on their feet after spending nearly 40 hours in stuffy, crammed rooms below deck, suffering immensely from seasickness. Coming down the gangways to shore, some could not contain their shouts of joy. They knew what fate had befallen most of their comrades, and how close they themselves were to death, and were therefore grateful to the crew of the Sigga for their rescue. The next day I gave my crew a long-deserved rest, dismissing 1/3 of the sailors to shore. When I saw Yamashita, a signalman in the first group of sailors leaving for shore leave, thanks to whom we had managed to detect the enemy in time, I invited him to my cabin. There I handed him my silver watch and said, "This is a present for distinguished service. I realize that this is too small a reward for saving a ship and 200 men. I bought this watch 20 years ago in New York on a training voyage." "I cannot accept it," Yamashita protested. "It's not just a watch. It's a memento of your youth. Besides, I haven't done anything special that isn't in my job description as a signalman. In any case, if I deserve an award, let the commander of the fleet make it official." "Take the watch and don't argue with me," Yamashita, I interrupted him. "You'll get nothing from the command, believe me. They even refused to give us credit for the torpedo hit, because you were the only one who saw it, and there were no other witnesses." "Mr. Captain First Rank Yamashita blurted out, "I definitely saw our torpedo hit. I've never lied to anyone in my life." "All right," I said, "things happen in the service. Go ashore and try to have a good time." I slipped the watch into his pocket. The signalman cooled down, smiled and saluted and left the cabin. I sat down to report on the details of the night's fighting in Vela Bay. On the one hand, I wanted to describe what had happened as truthfully as possible, but on the other hand, I didn't want to expose my comrades on other ships who had made a lot of mistakes. It took several hours before I finished my work and went to the upper deck. By this time, the first batch of shorebound sailors had already returned to the ship. Among them was Yamashita. His uniform was torn, his lips were smashed, and a purple bruise swelled under his eye. "What happened?" I demanded an explanation. "It's nothing, mister." Captain First Rank, the signalman stretched out. I stumbled and fell. "This morning you told me that you had never lied in your life," I said. "Why are you lying now?" "I'm sorry, mister." Captain First Rank Yamashita lowered his eyes. "I got into a fight with some bastards on shore." "Come to my quarters," I ordered. "Tell me what happened." Yamashita obediently followed me and in the cabin told me honestly what had happened to him. "It was like this, mister." Captain First Rank. I drank a couple of cups of sake. I was probably a little intoxicated. I was bragging about the watch you gave me. Then some fool comes up to me and says that our Shiger has shamefully fled the battlefield and disgraced the entire fleet. Then some other fool came along and said that the whole 27th Division was a bunch of cowards and slackers. So I punched him. Don't look at me, mister. Captain First Rank. They got what they deserved too, bastards. Yamashita, I asked, do you think the Shiger acted wrongly? No, Commander, he answered sincerely. You did everything perfectly right. It's just that those assholes on shore pissed me off. You should have paid no attention to that nonsense, I reprimanded the signalman. We're here to fight the Americans, not fight each other. Go to the infirmary and get cleaned up. After the battle in Vela Bay, the atmosphere on the Segura had changed dramatically. I realized that I had an experienced combat crew under my command. I felt confident for the coming battles, which did not slow down. Continuing their offensive, the Americans conducted a new marine landing on August 15th at Bailo near the southern tip of Vela La Vela. The new bridgehead, along with the one previously captured on Munda, was being held by the 12,000th Japanese garrison at Kolombangara. The reaction of the Japanese command was a plan to land reinforcements in Korania to destroy the new enemy bridgehead. For this purpose it was supposed to use, and all cash in the area of aviation. On the morning of August 16th, Yamagami and I were called to a meeting, which on board the destroyer Sazanami held the commander of the 3rd Destroyer Squadron, Rear Admiral Matsuji Ajuin. It had already been announced that he intended to personally lead the operation at Korania. Ajuin informed us that he achieved the command of the termination of the destroyer transport functions. From now on, the destroyers will be engaged only in escorting. Escorting squadron until a year ago always consisted of at least 8 destroyers. Unfortunately now, because of the heavy losses suffered in recent months, we will have to make do with 4 ships. I chose these 4 destroyers myself, said the Admiral, and I am sure that they are worth 8 other ships. Then the Admiral announced the names of the ships selected for the operation. Except for my Shiger, all the others were destroyers of the latest construction. Among them was the hero of the battle in Kula Bay on July 13th destroyer Hamakaze, which, among other things, was one of the few Japanese ships equipped with radar. It and the identical Isakays made up the 17th Destroyer Division under the command of Captain First Rank Toshio Miyazaki. Together with Aijuin's own flagship destroyer Sazanami, they were to form a convoy guard. It was a very rare case when such a small detachment of 4 destroyers had to lead into battle a whole constellation of senior officers, 1 rear admiral and 2 captains of the first rank. All this said that the high command of the defeat in the Bay of Vela made a strong impression. August 17th at 3 a.m. Our 4 destroyers left Rabaul, moving southward to rendezvous with a convoy of 20 self-propelled landing barges. The barges had left Bougainville with 400 troops on board to reinforce the forces of the Korania garrison. We were still about 100 miles from Rabaul when the radio operators intercepted a long message being transmitted by an American spy plane. Clearly it was about us. Admiral Ajuin radioed to Buin, asking for an aerial reconnaissance of the area so as not to be caught unawares by enemy ships. The first message from our reconnaissance plane came at 1:30 p.m., when the shores of Bougainville Island had already appeared on the southwestern horizon. It read 3 enemy destroyers are coming through Gizo Strait in the direction of Bailoa. Our squadron at a speed of 28 knots continued toward Bougainville. We were in a hurry to prevent the enemy from attacking the unescorted convoy which was slowly moving along the coast of Choiseul. At 2100 hours, the Vela Lavelle loomed on the horizon directly ahead. We were approaching our objective and probably a skirmish with 3 previously detected enemy destroyers. The tense silence that reigned on the bridge was interrupted by a shout from signalman Yamashita. I see enemy aircraft. At high altitude, an American bomber passed directly above us and disappeared into the clouds. Then, just as suddenly, a second plane appeared. This 5-yell torpedo bomber Avenger dropped a flare right over Siga. Our destroyers, breaking the Kilva-Tonogo formation, separated in different courses, opening anti-aircraft fire. Maneuvering at 30 knots, the ships closed smoke screens. Another bomber appeared from the clouds and, passing over the very masts of the Sazanami, dropped a few bombs. I thought with fear that it was one of the topmast men of which we had heard for months, but had never figured out how to dodge the bombs gliding over the surface of the water. But in this case I was wrong. The bombs were dropped in the usual manner. They lay close to the Sazanami, raising large columns of water around the flagship destroyer. Sazanami fought back with all guns, but never hit that brave American pilot. The planes were gone, although there was a good chance that they would return. Far on the horizon, the convoy we were to guard finally showed itself. It was still about an hour away. Everyone was anxiously looking up into the sky, waiting for another visit from American planes. So far they appeared in twos, but what would happen if they appeared more? The planes continued to attack us in pairs all the way to the entrance to Vela Bay. As the last of them flew away, the black, ominous silhouette of Kolombangara loomed over us again from the east. And again we were enveloped in pitch blackness. Are we not going again into a trap set by the enemy? With the Sazans on the radio, the order to turn 180 degrees to the west, because of poor visibility on the side of Kolombangara, was transmitted. Turning west, we had gone about 30 miles when the Sazanami beeped 4 enemy ships, bearing 190, distance 15,000 meters. Admiral Ajuin got us out of another trap, just in time. Sazanami's stern signal light flashed a new order: form up in battle order. Prepare for torpedo attack on port side. Admiral Ajuin later told me that he was overjoyed to discover that the enemy was pursuing us. I became convinced that the enemy, under the impression of his phenomenal victory on August 6th, would ignore the convoy and decide to engage us. I turned north to divert the Americans away from the convoy. At 22:32, our destroyers turned 45 degrees to the northwest. Everyone was watching the maneuvering of the enemy, to which the closest was having radar Hamakaze, covered by Sazanami. My Siga was taking up a position another 1,000 meters north of them. The enemy continued to follow full speed to the northeast, clearly demonstrating the fact that our previous maneuvering had gone unnoticed. The distance between us and the Americans was decreasing, and at 22:40 in the dark sky blossomed 2 signal flares, white and blue, fired by our scout plane. It was a prearranged signal, meaning the enemy ships are destroyers. The American column began a sudden sharp turn to the right in a westerly direction. Admiral Ajuin realized with horror that the enemy had stopped pursuing us and lay on a course to intercept the defenseless convoy. The Admiral immediately ordered all destroyers to make a 90-degree turn to the southwest in hopes of intercepting the enemy convoy before it collapses on unprotected landing barges. But a cursory calculation of the enemy's speed showed that this was impossible. Then Ajuin ordered to give on the Americans' torpedo salvo from the extreme distance, which was estimated by officers Sazanami was 8,000 meters. My own calculations showed more than 10,000 meters. From that distance, there was virtually no chance of achieving a hit. The American ships were traveling in an almost parallel course at a speed of over 30 knots. Disaster to our convoy seemed imminent, and Ajuin ordered torpedoes to be fired. At 22:52, all ships fired a torpedo salvo, firing 23 torpedoes. Our torpedoes were already halfway to the target when suddenly one of them stood upright in the ode, snapped in half, illuminating the darkness with a white-green fluorescent glow. The enemy ships noticed all this, of course, and made a sharp evasion to the right. As a result, all our torpedoes missed. Admiral Ajuin, looking at all this through binoculars from the bridge of the Sazanami, sighed. She should have broken down. Bad luck. But at least we drove them away from the convoy. at 22:55, Sazanami released 8 of his remaining torpedoes. The distance to the enemy was still 7,000 meters, but Aijuin didn't care. It was important for him to drive the Americans further away from our barges. The Americans made another sharp turn to the right and dodged the torpedoes. Then the admiral ordered to open artillery fire. Guns, Sazanami and Hamikadze rumbled. However, without searchlights it was difficult to ensure accurate aiming, and the distance was too long for our 127mm guns. My Siga and Isokais also rushed to approach the enemy, and at 22:59 I ordered to prepare to release a fan of 4 torpedoes. At the next moment, Segura was hit by a hail of enemy shells falling 20 to 40 meters from the ship, raising cascades of water and spray. The second and third salvo we were covered, miraculously avoiding direct hits. I tried to spot the enemy by the flashes of his guns, but saw nothing and realized that the Americans were using free-flowing gunpowder, rumors of which had been circulating for a long time. Such gunpowder, combined with the radar guidance of the guns, gave the Americans a huge advantage. Forgetting my own plans to launch a torpedo attack, I ordered a smoke screen and a zigzag course. We were running back and forth in the smoke screen at 30 knots, but every 6 seconds shells kept falling around us, every second threatening a direct hit. I did not open fire, waiting for a more convenient moment. And the enemy fire continued. The Americans were approaching on a bearing of 60 degrees, and I wanted to fire torpedoes at them first, and then open fire from the guns so as not to disrupt the torpedo gunners aiming. Pillars of water from American underflight and overflight were crashing down on the bridge, showering us from head to toe. Approaching 5,000 meters, I gave the torpedo launchers the command PI and began to turn to the left, watching the movement of the torpedoes. The enemy continued to fire. I returned fire, and the hull of Siga shook like a leaf from the onboard salvo. There was a deafening roar. Enemy shells were falling all around, but none of them hit us. Through the thunder of salvos and bursts, I heard the cry of a signalman from a crow's nest in the mast. A torpedo hit the second enemy ship from the lead. Our shells have hit the third enemy ship. I could not see the proof of this because of the smoke, but the news raised the morale of the crew. At that time, the radar of the destroyer Hamikadze detected the approach to the battle site of a powerful enemy compound. Captain First Rank Miyazaki suggested withdrawing to the northwest. At 23, Shiga and Isokais turned to the northwest. Sazanami and Hamikadze, jointly maneuvering, also lay down on a course of withdrawal. The shells continued to raise water columns around us for another 10 minutes. We still didn't get a single hit. Isokais was less fortunate. Caught under concentrated enemy fire, Isokais fired 8 torpedoes at the Americans. The enemy clearly made an evasive maneuver, continuing to fire. From the fragments of close bursting shells on the Isokais broke out a small fire. Several people were injured. The Hamikadze was also lightly damaged. But the Sazanami and Shiga didn't even get a scratch. This was the second battle in a row when my destroyer was so lucky. Meanwhile, 20 barges with the landing party, taking advantage of the fact that we carried away 4 enemy destroyers, skipped along the coast and took refuge in the coves behind the coral reefs. The soldiers spent daylight hours on barges, and at nightfall were brought ashore. Until 23:21, the Americans followed a parallel course with us. And then, having made 2 consecutive turns to the right at 90 degrees, turned on a reverse course in the direction of the convoy. Captain First Rank Raihin in his report indicated that he was forced to stop chasing our destroyers because the Japanese were leaving at a speed of 35 knots, and we could develop only 30. This is, to put it mildly, incorrect, since both my Siga and the damaged Isokais were going at a speed of no more than 28 knots. However, and having turned on a reverse course, the Americans did not even make an attempt to attack our helpless landing barges. In the report of the enemy says that the destroyers Rayner used up in the battle almost all the ammunition, but for the barges would be enough and large caliber machine guns. Perhaps Rayner believed that our destroyers acted again on the model of the Tokyo Express, having on board the main forces of the landing force and their cargo. By driving us away from Kolombangara, he thought he had disrupted the landing of Japanese reinforcements. Another mystery of this battle is the fact that the enemy did not use torpedoes. This is strange, given the recent triumph of American torpedo weapons. The signalman's report from the SIGA of our torpedo hit was never confirmed. Perhaps it was a battle hallucination, or perhaps the torpedo exploded after being caught in the keel jet of an enemy destroyer. However, Admiral Ijuin did not share my doubts and skepticism. Considering the results of the battle excellent, he wrote in his report the most valiant ship of the squadron was the destroyer SIGA, sinking torpedoes Chrysler enemy. Strongly criticized our withdrawal from the battle after the report of Hamakaze, which detected with his radar approach to the battle site of a new enemy compound. Later it turned out that the radar had mistaken the barges of our own convoy for the enemy. Our detachment returned to Rabaul on August 18th. The happy and proud crew of the SIGA received a well-deserved shore leave the next day. In these days of fierce fighting with heavy casualties, it was a real challenge to get through 2 battles in a row without damage or loss of personnel. And while our previous return had given rise to much gossip and speculation, that time no one had any doubts as to the valor of the old destroyer. The next day I had breakfast at the officers' club with Admiral Ijuin and Captain First Rank Miyatsushi. Both were so complimentary of the SIGA that they ended up putting me in a state of extreme embarrassment. "I'm sorry, Hara," the Admiral said, "that you, as a division commander, have to command only one ship, and one that is so outdated. But bear with me. You'll be getting new ships soon." Admiral Ijuin had the hereditary title of Baron. Even so, he was very easygoing, devoid of any of the arrogance so common to the family aristocracy. In the old days he had the reputation of being one of the best navigators in the Navy. Having finished breakfast, we decided to take a walk around the island. Rabaul was still a quiet rear base. Rare enemy air raids did not disturb the general tranquility. A warm southeastern breeze moved the luxuriant foliage of coconut palms. On this distant tropical base they had long ago stopped paying attention to formalities. We were dressed in short-sleeved t-shirts and shorts, with straw hats or cork helmets on our heads. The sailors swarming around us, of course, did not give the honor, and we were even pleased to remain unnoticed. The stores on the island were in full swing, owned mostly by Chinese. What an amazing people! While the Japanese and Americans clashed in mortal combat, the unperturbed Chinese seemed to think of nothing but increasing their economic control over the island. There was also a very exotic native population on the island, showing up at the base in their national dress, consisting of feathers in their heads and loincloths. Sometimes right on some vacant lot they would stage their ritual dances, attracting crowds of sailors from various ships. The attraction of the island was its famous hot springs, where the command organized purely Japanese baths for the personnel. The baths enjoyed such fame that even admirals were not squeamish about them. Meanwhile, the Americans, constantly increasing the strength of their strikes, continued their offensive along the chain of islands in the archipelago. While we were enjoying a vacation in Rabaul, began the evacuation of Japanese troops from the island of St. Isabella, lying almost parallel to the islands Vella La Vella, Kolombangara and New Georgia. After resting for 3 days at Rabaul, Miyazaki and I received new orders. With a detachment of 3 destroyers, we were to break through to Ricata on the northeastern tip of St. Isabella Island and evacuate as many soldiers as possible from there, of which there were about 3,500. With the SIGA, the Hamakaze was again going on this campaign. The damaged Isakaze was replaced by the destroyer Minatsuki. The 3 of us put to sea on the morning of August 22nd, having on board food and ammunition for those who could not be removed from the island. Each destroyer could take no more than 250 passengers. Our task was complicated by the fact that the day before another group of destroyers removed from the island 600 people. The enemy already knew about the operation, and we prepared for the worst. The approaches to Ricata were very dangerous because of the great number of reefs and shoals not marked on the map. On our charts, copied from English charts of 1939, the following note was made: for this area these islands have been only partially described and the waters around them remain unknown. Great care and caution are required when sailing in this area. We had not gone more than 100 miles from Rabaul when 3 enemy planes appeared at 20,000 feet. We immediately opened barrage fire. At that altitude, we couldn't reach them anyway. The enemy planes dropped no bombs, but kept us under constant strain by circling over our heads. After about 10 minutes, 6 of our Zeros appeared on the scene, flying out of Bok. They pounced furiously on the Americans, making several runs at them. But the enemy bombers B-24, apparently, were as if invulnerable and continued their round dance over us. Eventually the Americans withdrew, and our fighters continued to cover our southward movement until darkness fell. Having dropped to a low speed, we were already approaching the unknown reefs and banks around Choiseul when the radio operators received an urgent radio message from Ricata 4 cruisers, and several enemy destroyers have been sighted at the entrance to the port of Ricata. I even groaned with anger. Our overloaded destroyers, forced to follow a short course due to lack of accurate charts, could be easy prey for such a powerful enemy formation. As I pondered the situation, a signal light flashed from the Hamaka's retreat to the sea to maintain a speed of 24 knots until we received more complete data on the enemy. We turned away from the coast, taking a course to the north, where enemy radar could spot us with much greater ease than against the shore. Indeed, we did not have time to stay on the new course in 10 minutes, as radio intercepts showed that the enemy scout planes have already noticed and reported the change in our course. It remained to decide what we should do in such a situation. The maps showed the enemy was still 30 miles away. Should we go back under the cover of the coast to disappear from the screens of American radar? Should we try to pass along the coast and attack the enemy? But by attacking, we can at best knock out a couple of enemy ships. And then what? I was interrupted again by a signal from the Hamaka's. Order from Rabaul to return to base immediately without engaging in combat. Return at 30 knots. I breathed a sigh of relief. About midnight we set course back to Rabaul, where we arrived on the afternoon of August 23rd. 2 days later we again reached Ricata. The weather was foggy, and under its cover we hoped to break through to the goal of our campaign. With the onset of darkness, visibility dropped to a few hundred meters. When we arrived at the island of St. Isabella, the weather was equally overcast. As there was no enemy in the area, we wished the weather would improve. At a speed of 6 knots, we sailed past the reefs and shoals at the entrance to Ricata, stopping every 100 meters to make depth measurements. The work was as nerve-wracking as waiting for the enemy. We waddled around for about 2 hours, until we noticed a faint signal from shore, showing us the approach path to the piers. Eventually, all 3 destroyers managed to squeeze into the narrow harbour. At 1 o'clock in the morning of August 25th, we began unloading. Several hundred soldiers waited on the darkened pier for the order to board. The tense silence of the night was suddenly broken by the roar of the engines of 2 American bombers that leaped out of the darkness at the height of our masts and disappeared into the low clouds. The bombs they had dropped began to tear around, raising huge columns of water and mud. Fortunately, there were no direct hits, and the whole incident served to make the unloading work quicker. As soon as the decks were cleared of cargo, soldiers poured aboard via the gangways. It was still dark when we set out on the return trip. This time we had to maneuver between the reefs without stopping. Everything went well, and at 2:30 we went to the open sea, increasing the speed to 30 knots. Everyone was expecting again the appearance of enemy planes. An hour after we entered the open sea, dawn began to break. We were sailing along the coast of Choiseul. Another hour passed and we reached the Strait of Bougainville. And that's when the American planes appeared. Fortunately, we noticed their approach and we had time to spread out with a smoke screen. Hamakaze and Minatsuki increased to 35 knots, my Shiga to 30. This time there were about a dozen enemy planes, and they seemed to be coming from all directions. Our guns were firing continuously, but no hits were visible. Desperately maneuvering, I again noticed how poorly the Shiga obeyed the rudder. The raid lasted about 5 minutes. The Shiga was lucky again. Not a single bomb fell even close to the destroyer. Coming out of the smoke screen, we saw 2 other destroyers ahead at 3,000 meters. I immediately noticed that Hamakaze was in trouble. The destroyer was unsteady on course. A fire was raging on her half-tank. The Minatsuki looked fine at first glance. Shiga approached, and from Hamakaze's flags transmitted direct hit in the half-tank. 36 dead. Speed down to 20 knots. Assume heading for Shortland, Miyazaki. Shortland was our nearest base only 30 miles away. But it was very dangerous for ships to be there, as the base had no air cover. I ordered a message to the Hamakaze captain, first rank Hara objects to your decision. The base at Shortland is unsafe. We'll return to Rabaul at 20 knots. I will tow you if necessary. Miyazaki agreed to my proposal. The fire was put out on the Hamakaze, and we all continued northward together. Although we were going agonizingly slowly, we reached Rabaul. No more enemy planes appeared. Hundreds of people huddled on the piers, cheering our return and marveling at the fact that the destroyer column was led by the old Shiga, which would have been the first casualty of any raid, rather than the newer, faster Hamakaze. I felt sorry for Miyazaki when we met at headquarters the next day. A brilliant sailor and an excellent commander of various destroyer formations, he was considered, despite his relative youth, the first candidate for the rank of admiral. But now for him there was some bad luck, when in every battle destroyers of his division were damaged. Today, all 3 destroyers, Yukikazes, Yasukazes, and Hamakaze, were under repair, which of course made it difficult for him to receive the rank of admiral. Miyazaki looked frustrated and depressed. However, Admiral Ajuin greeted him cordially, holding out a piece of paper. Read it, Miyazaki, and rejoice at how lucky you are. Miyazaki read and handed the piece of paper to me with a sad smile. It was a radiogram from Shortland, saying that the base had been hit by a massive airstrike. Thank you, Hara, Miyazaki said, shaking my hand. If I hadn't listened to you, the Hamakaze would have been sunk by now. You saved me and my crew. 4 days later, Admiral Ajuin summoned me and the commander of the Shiga to his headquarters. The squadron commander looked thoughtful and uncertain. Your Shiga will have to make the trip to Tuluva alone, he said after a moment of silence. It gives me no pleasure at all to entrust you with such a task. But all the other destroyers under my command will continue the evacuation of Rikata. The Shiga was chosen for independent action precisely because it has you on board, Hara. And we know that you are the only one capable of such a task. I replied that Yamagami and I were honored that our lone destroyer was being assigned the task of an entire division. Admiral Ajuin was very pleased with our reaction. He shook hands with us for a long time, reminding us that our Shiga had already earned the nickname Indestructible in the fleet. Tulu, on the northern tip of Cape Gloucester Island of New Britain. The Japanese had a small airbase. Although the enemy now had air superiority in the area, the airbase at Tulu was successful in its primary mission of reconnaissance over the sea, becoming Rabaul's forward observation post. There was no land route from Rabaul to Tuluvu, and all supplies to the base came by sea. Tuluvu was located at the western entrance to the Bismarck Sea, where in early March the enemy first used Tokmakto bombing, sinking 4 of our destroyers and all 8 transports. It was at Tuluvu lost the destroyer Ariake, along with Mikatsuki on July 28th. Both destroyers sat on the rocks and were killed by enemy aircraft. Tuluvu was within range of enemy aircraft, and any ship that appeared there could count on the most warm meeting from the Americans, including Topmaster Vikami. And how to evade topmast attacks, as much as we thought, we have not decided. At noon on September 1st, Sigga left Rabaul for Tuluva. At 18 knots we were sailing along the coast of New Britain, as dangerous and treacherous as the coast of any of the Solomon Islands. By nightfall we approached Cape Holmina at the northern tip of the Willamette Peninsula, about halfway between Rabaul and Tuluvu. The Sigga was entering the danger zone. In the radio room they could hear the conversations of American airplanes somewhere nearby. An hour later the radio operators reported that they had intercepted a message from an enemy reconnaissance plane, which, judging by the clarity of reception, was directly above us. The message could not be deciphered, but it seemed to communicate our position, speed and course. As we moved westward, the visibility became increasingly poor. It was incredibly hot. There was a tense silence on the bridge. I wiped my face with my handkerchief, thinking it had never been so stuffy. My navigator, Lieutenant Tukihara, suggested that we were entering the oncoming downpour, and he was right. The downpour sheltered us, and although visibility was reduced to just a few meters, we turned southwest toward the rocky shore under the cover of the rain squall. The radio room reported hearing no more enemy planes. We proclaimed glory to the weather and the gods who control it. It was 8 p.m. The tension had subsided. Refreshed by the downpour, people came out of their stupor. Some exchanged jokes, some laughed. And at that moment a terrible howl and roar of a dive bomber came into our ears, which jumped out of the clouds right above our bridge. A terrible deafening explosion followed, and then several more. Another plane thundered over our masts. I could not understand where the enemy dive bombers had come from. They appeared so suddenly that we did not even have time to open fire. The Sigga rolled to the left, and a bomb exploded in our wake. The second one was just off the half-tank. The bridge exploded. Tons of water rained down on the bow of the destroyer, foaming over the gun turrets. Standing still under the waterfalls of water falling on the bridge, I gave the command. Helm starboard. Immediately bring the course to the fullest. Now. I saw Tukihara's confused face as he moved the engine telegraph lever to its fullest position. Captain Third Rank Yamagami was duplicating the order over the intercom while loudly saying a prayer. The reaction of the officers was quite understandable. I have never had to give such commands before, and many can serve in the Navy for a lifetime without giving or hearing such orders. Under normal conditions it takes half an hour to go from an economical run of 12 knots to a maximum speed of 30 knots. Under wartime conditions this period was reduced to 15 minutes. I immediately ignored all regulations and instructions, creating the risk of ruining the turbines, whose blades might not be able to withstand such a drastic change in operating mode. The cigarette sprang up like a horse under the blow of a whip. The turbines held, but flames erupted from the tailpipe, illuminating the ship and everything around it. We were numb. Dive bombers rarely missed such a beautiful target. In terrible tension we waited for the bombers to appear. The minutes passed languidly. And then from the radio room reported that intercepted a message of American pilots, transmitted in plain text. They reported that they achieved several direct hits in the Japanese destroyer, which is burning and sinking. I could hardly believe my ears and asked the radio operators to read the intercepted message again. Having written us off, the American dive bombers left. And we, again reducing speed to 12 knots and shrouded in thickening darkness, reached Tuluvu without any new incidents. Having handed over the cargo, we, escorted by joyful shouts of aviators, went on the way back and again arrived in Rabaul safe and sound. After returning to Rabaul, Sigga was put into repair. The destroyer's worn-out boilers and machinery, as well as its overgrown and corroded hull, were in need of repair. We stood in repair until mid-September. During this time, the military situation became even worse. The enemy cut the main lines of our communications. Garrisons on remote islands were isolated and simply starved to death. Before the High Command clearly faced the need for a new retreat, it was decided to evacuate the entire region around Kolombangara. Just in time for the commencement of this operation, the SIGA was back in service. On September 21st, we withdrew the garrisons from Arundela and Gizo, which had been guarding Kolombangara from the flanks in the south and southwest. By early October, this operation had been successfully completed at the cost of only 66 casualties. The next was to be the evacuation of Vella Lavelle. The troops withdrawn from there, as from the other islands, were concentrated on Bougainville. Admiral Ijuin was ordered to evacuate 600 soldiers of the local garrison from Corania. To accomplish the task, Admiral Ijuin formed 3 support groups from 9 destroyers. Considering that to evacuate the 10,000 garrison Kolombangara used only 25 destroyers, the allocated forces could be considered very solid. The operation did not seem particularly difficult, because the garrison of Corania was to be transported to Buin on the island of Bougainville, i.e. a distance of no more than 50 miles. By the way, this army unit, which was to be removed from the island, we ourselves had landed on it a month and a half ago. On October 6th, we left Rabaul under the command of Admiral Ijuin, organized as follows. The general direction of the operation is Rear Admiral Ijuin. First Support Group destroyers Akigumo, Isokais, Kaisigumo and Yugumo. Second Support Group destroyers Shiga and Sameda. First Transport Group destroyers Fumitsuki, Matsukaze, Unagi. First Transportation Group 4 submarine hunters and 20 landing barges. Admiral Ijuin carried his flag on the destroyer Akigumo. Second in command was the experienced Captain First Rank Miyazaki, marching on the Isokais. The 4 ships of Group 1 under the command of the Admiral himself were capable of speeds up to 35 knots. Accordingly, according to the tactical plan Ijuin had drawn up, he would attempt to draw the enemy into a pursuit to target my 2 destroyers. While the transport group will be able to accomplish its task without American opposition, our 9 destroyers, divided into 3 groups, will not allow the enemy to accurately determine the composition of our forces and therefore correctly assess the situation. The day was cloudy, sometimes it rained. We were glad of this. Under the cover of rain, we could carry out the operation without meeting the enemy at all. We were sneaking along the shore of Bougainville when the radio operators intercepted an encrypted enemy radiogram. It is not known whether it came from a spy plane or from a secret observer hiding in the jungle of the island, but it is clear that it was reporting on us. Everyone was disappointed to learn that we had been discovered so quickly. Now we had to wait for an airstrike. We increased the distance between the ships from 500 to 1,000 meters. At about 3 p.m., several enemy planes appeared from the direction of Choiseul, but fortunately a rain squall came, covering us for about half an hour. During that time, the planes disappeared somewhere. As the sun set, I received a message from the flagship that his group intended to go full steam toward Vella Lavella. I was instructed to reduce speed to 9 knots and remain off the coast of Shortland to meet the barges, the appearance of which was expected shortly. Ijuin and his 4 destroyers then entered the Straits of Bougainville at 26 knots. In the darkness, to go at this speed through these waters was very risky, but all was without incident. My 2 destroyers slowly passed through the strait and exactly at the specified time met east of Shortland transport convoy. Ijuin had almost reached Corania when he spotted the 4 destroyers in the darkness. Another rain squall had come in and completely blocked visibility. However, Ijuin remembered the American radar-guided guns and did not dare to go any further. At this point, he received a radiogram that read, a reconnaissance plane from Rabaul detected 4 enemy cruisers and 3 destroyers heading westward north of Vella La Vella. After reading the radiogram, Ijuin ordered his group to prepare to reverse course. As it later turned out, the message from the scout plane turned out to be completely wrong, but it led to a serious tactical error by Admiral Ijuin. Personally, I think that the inexperience of the pilot of the reconnaissance plane was to blame. Apparently, in the breaks in the clouds, he detected a group of 3 American destroyers. Seeing them from time to time from different positions, he mistook them for 2 or 3 separate groups and reported to headquarters. If this report was correct, the whole picture of the upcoming battle could look different. Firepower cruiser 10 times the firepower of the destroyer. This was what made Admiral Ijuin somewhat hesitant, mindful of the murderous accuracy of radar-guided fire. He also knew that in such low visibility conditions his destroyers would not be able to counter such a powerful enemy formation. When the reconnaissance report was received by me on the Sigga, although I was surprised at such a rapid appearance of the enemy, I had no reason to doubt the accuracy of the report itself. I realized the dilemma facing the Admiral to continue the operation or to call it off. It was a difficult decision. Admiral Ijuin's squadron was disproportionately strong for such a minor troop evacuation operation as we were undertaking. Cancelling the operation would be a terrible blow to the Admiral's reputation. While Ijuin hesitated, mulling over various possibilities, his group continued southward at 26 knots. At the same time, 3 American destroyers under the command of Captain First Rank Walker, leading a convoy on his flagship Selfridge, spotted Ijuin's ships at 21:31 and decided they were a Japanese transport convoy. Walker ordered his destroyers to increase speed to 33 knots and attack the convoy at the same time. He called in another group of 3 U.S. destroyers maneuvering at that moment off the northern coast of New Georgia, about 20 miles from Walker. Visibility that night varied dramatically, sometimes reaching 15,000 meters and at other times dropping to virtually 0. Thus, Capt. First Rank Walker detected the Japanese ships, while Ijuin knew nothing of his destroyers yet. While Walker's destroyers went full steam ahead to approach Ijuin's group, I received orders from the Admiral to join him as soon as possible. I received this order at 20:10 and immediately went to join Ijuin's group, increasing speed to 30 knots. Admiral Ijuin still knew nothing of the enemy's approach. Waiting for the approach of my 2 destroyers, he turned his ships in a westerly direction at 20:29. 6 minutes later I radioed him, "Due to poor visibility, I cannot locate you. I request that the Yugumo turn on her blue stern light." It was 20:35. The Admiral ordered his destroyers to turn left and the Yugumo to turn on her identification fire. Ijuin's column made 2 more successive turns, and finally at 20:38 I spotted the blue identification fire. A minute later Ijuin detected a column of enemy ships approaching from the east. The 4 destroyers of the first group, increasing speed to 35 knots, turned south. Although it was believed that the enemy column consisted of 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers, Admiral Ijuin decided to go out to torpedo a tow attack, repeating the same tactics as on August 17th. Unfortunately, as often happens at night, the Admiral slightly misjudged the distance to the enemy. The American ships seemed closer to him than they really were. At 20:45, Admiral Ijuin realized his mistake. The enemy column held on the same course, but was still far enough away. The Admiral ordered a turn to the southeast to correct the mistake, and at 20:48 commanded a turn all of a sudden 45 degrees to the right. And that's where Admiral Ijuin made his second mistake. Turn all of a sudden is a very difficult maneuver, especially for destroyers, following at high speed in a tight Kilva-Tonomu formation. To successfully perform this maneuver, the flagship needs to know the exact position of each ship in the column, keep in touch with them, so that all ships began the maneuver at the same time. Therefore, all communication channels of the flagship destroyer were busy communicating with the rest of the ships of the column, and communication with my group of 2 destroyers was lost. After misjudging the distance to the enemy and the erroneous command to turn all of a sudden, the admiral was horrified to see that he had taken a position in which his ships became an excellent target for the enemy. The Americans had an excellent opportunity to strike a crushing blow at Ijuin's column and then follow northward and destroy the Japanese transport convoy. Realizing the horror of such a development, tired and somewhat confused Ijuin makes another, this time the biggest of all his mistakes. He orders his ships to make another turn all of a sudden to the left. This lines up his ships in a jagged front line, setting them up even better for an enemy attack. At 20:56, Ijuina's destroyers made another all-of-a-sudden turn, this time to the right, rearranging themselves from a front-line formation back into a kill-veta column, exposing their rearguard to the enemy's onboard salvo. The USS Yugumo followed at the end, being only 3,000 meters from the American radar-guarded guns. At this point, the enemy opened artillery fire and fired torpedoes. The destroyer Yugumo was immediately hit by 5 shells. Yugumo rolled out of formation to the left, opened a fierce return fire, and fired 8 torpedoes at the enemy. The destroyer Keisugumo next ahead also opened artillery fire, but could not release torpedoes for fear of hitting the damaged Yugumo with them. Isokai's and Akigumo had no opportunity on their course to even open artillery fire. Meanwhile, the Yugumo, hit by several more shells, lost control and began to drift to the southwest. At 21:03, she was hit on the starboard side by at least 1 American torpedo, exploded, and after remaining on the surface for a few more minutes, sank. None of its crew survived. The 3 remaining Ijuin ships fled the area in a chaotic mess. It took them 10 minutes to regroup, after which the entire group departed in a westerly direction. The 3 American destroyers, which had hitherto acted impeccably, were apparently the victim of overconfidence. At 20:56, after opening fire and torpedoing the Yugumo, they turned to the right. Had they stayed on that course, they would most likely have survived. But after about a minute and a half straight ahead, the Americans spotted 2 more Japanese destroyers, the Shiga and Samedar, at a distance of 13,000 meters. They immediately reversed course, parallel to their new targets, and prepared to attack. This in itself was a correct maneuver, but it failed to take into account only 1 danger, a torpedo salvo from the dying Yugumo. Excited by their success, the American sailors forgot about this danger and were severely punished. One of the torpedoes Yugumo hit the American destroyer Chevalier, causing detonation of the war cellars. This happened at 21:01, 2 minutes before the Yugumo itself exploded. At 21:05, at the very moment when the Yugumo disappeared into the abyss, the American squadron suffered another disaster. Destroyer Oahu Annam crashed at full speed directly into the middle of the starboard side of the dying Chevalier. The 3rd American destroyer Selfridge, the only one still intact, continued to approach Shiga and Samedar, firing guns. The fire was very ineffective. Opened at 21:04, it lasted 2.5 minutes when a torpedo struck the bow of the Selfridge. This was one of 16 torpedoes fired a few minutes earlier by the Shiga and Samedar. Now I want to go back to 2038, when 3 minutes had elapsed when I requested Admiral Ijuin to show by light signal my position, as I could not locate his group due to poor visibility. Noticing the blue identification signal turned on by the Yugumo, I went full speed in the direction indicated. Suddenly some black object that looked like a small island appeared off the port side. But there were no islets in these waters. At that moment, signalman Yamashita reported, "Unidentified objects 50 degrees left on the bow. Looks like cruisers or destroyers, probably enemy. Approaching." I looked through the eyepieces of a huge 20-centimeter binocular. That's right. Some ships were coming right at us. I couldn't count them because they were coming in a column, when the lead ship was covering the others. At 2040 from Samedar, which also found them, transmitted a signal enemy ships on course 115 degrees. The enemy was rapidly approaching. I watched them through binoculars, pondering my actions. The distance to them was now 13,000 meters. I decided that the best thing to do was to launch a couple of torpedo fans towards them. To improve our position in the torpedo attack, I ordered us to turn slightly to the left. By 2055, when the distance to the enemy was already 10,000 meters and we were within range of his radar-controlled guns, I lost sight of the identification signal raised by the Yugumo. Besides, I, still believing that the enemy's formation consisted of 4 cruisers and 3 destroyers, was thinking more of saving my 2 ships from destruction than of inflicting any serious damage on the Americans. Seeing that the enemy column was turning to the right, I, too, at 2058, commanded a sharp turn to the right. Now we were separated by a distance of 8,500 meters. In the torpedo firing instructions I had drawn up, the ideal position was considered to be on a parallel course just ahead of the enemy. With a light signal and over the radio, I transmitted to Samedar the order to prepare to release torpedoes and open fire. At this very moment, the enemy was setting us his port side, wanting to put into action all his guns at once. Realizing this, at 2059 I ordered at 2059 to turn to the right a little more, so that, having sharply approached the enemy, I could disrupt his aiming and, consequently, the time of opening fire. At this point I was infuriated by the commander of the Samedar, who, like a fool, asked me over the radio would we fight on this new course. Tell him, I hissed, that we will still turn left. We were about 500 meters closer to the Americans when I ordered a left turn and gave the command to fire a torpedo salvo. It was 21 hours and 30 seconds. The enemy was from us on a bearing of 50 degrees to starboard at a distance of 7,500 meters. 16 fish spat into the water from my 2 destroyers, and torpedoists began to hastily reload the apparatus. Torpedoes were still on their way to the target, when around my ships began to rise columns of water from enemy shells. With the first salvo, the Americans reached the cover, but none of our ships received direct hits. I waited for the torpedo tubes to be reloaded, preparing to open artillery fire with the new torpedo salvo. The Sigger shrieked as the hull bent from the onboard salvo as 5 of our 127mm shells rumbled, illuminating the darkness of the ocean night and blinding everyone on the bridge. The powder smoke obscured all visibility for a moment. The first thing I heard, stunned by the rattle of the guns and the flashes of the salvo, was the voice of Yamashita's signalman shouting that one of our torpedoes had hit its target. As my eyes again became accustomed to the darkness, I saw the explosion on the lead ship of the enemy's column, but the ships that followed it were nowhere to be seen. The signalmen confirmed that they could see only one enemy destroyer. This led us to assume that all 3 American destroyers were victims of our torpedoes. We, of course, could not imagine that Chevalier and Zero N in distress at 6,000 meters astern of the lead ship. Poor visibility was to blame. In an attempt to check the results of our torpedo attack, I again turned my ships to the right. After 10 minutes of fruitless searching, I ordered a 90-degree turn to the left and a return to base. The erroneous report transmitted by a reconnaissance plane about the presence of enemy cruisers in the area continued. Meanwhile, feverishly the group of 3 remaining destroyers Admiral Ejuina. After the loss of Yugumo, they continued to withdraw in complete disorder in a westerly direction. At 21:13, their signalers spotted the Chevalier and Zero Ehenan in the distance, mistaking them for 4 American cruisers in a panic. Although both destroyers were standing motionless, for some reason Ijuin's destroyers thought they were approaching. At 21:19, 3 destroyers of Group 1 fired 24 torpedoes at the mirage they saw, none of which hit the target. Signalmen through the night haze saw the glow of fire from the fires on Selfridge. And Chevalier, which gave rise to a report of the sinking of 2 cruisers or large destroyers of the enemy by our torpedoes, This was another mirage born of panic. Admiral Ijuin then turned his ships northward and returned to base. Meanwhile, a Japanese transport convoy reached Korania without any interference. In 2 hours, they evacuated 589 men from the local garrison without suffering any casualties. Thus, as a result of this battle, 1 American destroyer was sunk and 2 were damaged. We lost 1 destroyer. The Americans lost almost as many men as died on the Yugumo, although we did not know at the time that about a third of the Yugumo's crew was picked up by American destroyers. But the most important thing is that despite all the mistakes, we managed to conduct the convoy without any losses. And that was already a victory. I personally believe that this battle could have ended with a complete victory of the Americans if Walker turned not to the north, but to the south, and would have finished with Artillery 3 escaping in panicked destroyers Admiral Ijuina. But this is only a hypothesis. Naval battles are always full of mistakes, hallucinations, and surprises. On my return to Rabaul, I found Admiral Ijuin shocked and ashamed. No one openly condemned him, but the High Command frankly expressed their attitude to this battle, awarding me a ceremonial sword, and my commanders Captain 3rd Rank Yamagami with the Shiga and Sujihara with the Samidar, honorary dirks. Of the first group of destroyers, no one received any awards or commendations, although this was the first Japanese success at sea for the past 3 months. Our success was celebrated the next day, October 7th. The sword and dirk ceremony, as usual, ended with a banquet. Everything took place in our luxurious officers' club, where almost all the top officers were present for the occasion, including Vice Admiral Kusaka, commander of Naval Group South and the 11th Air Fleet, and Vice Admiral Samijima, commander of the 8th Fleet. An enormous amount of sake was served, and when the women appeared, the ceremonial part immediately degenerated into raucous revelry. The women were geishas hired by the Ministry of the Navy and sent to major forward bases to boost the morale of the personnel. Making a toast, Admiral Kusaka said, "The life of a destroyer in Rabaul lasts less than 2 months on average, and only 1 ship, continuously engaged in combat for 3 months straight, did not receive a scratch or lose a single man from its crew. I propose a toast to Captain 1st Rank Hara, Captain 3rd Rank Yamagami, and the entire crew of the illustrious destroyer Shiga." The table became increasingly noisy. Suddenly, one of the staff officers stood up and addressed the Admiral. "Mr. Admiral Kusaka, I have long wanted to ask you a question, but did not dare. May I ask it now?" From such an unheard-of impertinence, the room immediately fell dead silent. But the Admiral nodded complacently, and the young officer continued. "Mr. Admiral, you have just noted with incomprehensible pride how short the life of the destroyer in the created environment. But why did such a situation arose? Why are all our big ships holed up on Truk? On October 20th, we can celebrate the 1-year anniversary since our aircraft carriers last engaged in combat. It's been an entire year of warfare solely by destroyers alone, not to mention the fact that they are still being used as transports. Why, in such an important theatre of war, put the entire burden of war on the destroyers? And where are all our aircraft carriers, battleships, and cruisers?" Such audacity on the part of the young officer was not expected by anyone, although he expressed the thoughts that tormented all of us. Admiral Kusaka was grimly silent. In his place, Admiral Samejima spoke in tense silence. "I believe," he said, not quite confidently, "that the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Koga, is making preparations for a decisive battle that will involve all of our large ships." The officer who asked the question laughed drunkenly. "A decisive battle? When will it be, this decisive battle? What can they do even now, if they haven't fought for a whole year? A whole year, which was a whole century for our destroyers. A whole year, during which the enemy has increased their combat training so much that already in everything superior to us. It was obvious that because of a large dose of drink this officer lost control of himself. His buddies tried to interrupt the flow of revelations, to put the drunk in his seat or take him out of the club. He fought back and kept yelling. And what does the Imperial headquarters in Tokyo report? The enemy is bleeding in the Solomon Islands. We are the ones bleeding here, not the enemy. Two buddies finally grabbed him and dragged him out of the hall. This episode had some strange effect on me. I, too, was quite drunk and stood staggering and leaning on the long ceremonial sword that Admiral Samejima had solemnly handed me. I approached him and said, "Admiral, I want this sword back because I have not earned it. But even if I have earned it, what am I supposed to do with it on the ship?" Everyone froze in surprise at my prank. The first to recover from his shock was Captain First Rank Miyazaki. He jumped up and hugged me, saying, "Hara, you're overworked. Let's go home, Hara. You need to rest." I shoved him off and continued. "I want to trade this sword for my crew. My sailors must be rewarded somehow. Admiral Samejima, buy drinks for my sailors. Not for myself." My immediate commander, Rear Admiral Ijuin, appeared beside me. "It's all right, Hara. I'll get drinks for your sailors. But now everyone's tired and we should go." I woke up the next morning with a terrible hangover. Captain Third Rank Yamagami sorrowfully reminded me of my prank and how Admiral Ijuin and Captain First Rank Miyazaki had dragged me, roaring, from the banquet. Such behavior by a senior officer was unheard of in the Imperial Navy, and to the agony of over-drinking was added the shame of my behavior and the fear of waiting for the possible consequences. Strange as it may seem, I did not pay for my shameful behavior, and when the rumor of my prank spread among the sailors, it only added to my popularity. The fact that I got away with it all seems to indicate that many of my superiors shared the general discontent with the High Command. The High Command in Tokyo had ordered a withdrawal to Bougainville as the last line of defense. But in a combat zone, this order did not add optimism to anyone. The island of Bougainville was 3 times the size of Guadalcanal, and its coastline, which had virtually no defense, provided many potential landing sites for the enemy. Admiral Mainichi Koga, who had taken over as Commander-in-Chief after the death of Admiral Yamamoto in April 1943, did nothing at all and was never seen. It is unclear what was doing, and Vice Admiral Isaburo Ozawa, who replaced in November 1942 Admiral Nogumo at the post of Commander of Aircraft Carrier Formations, standing idle at anchor and the ships of the Second Fleet, which since August 1943 commanded by Vice Admiral Kurita, who replaced Admiral Kondo. 6 months after the death of Admiral Yamamoto, and his policy continued. Ever since the battle in the Java Sea in February 1942, I have been convinced that participation in only one battle teaches much more than participation in 1,000 maneuvers. Unfortunately, the commanding admirals did not share my views. They continued to keep the main forces of our fleet in Rabaul, or, even worse, in the waters of the metropolis, motivated by the need to save ships and prepare personnel. The result was that neither ships nor men turned out to be ready for battles when life itself forced these battles to begin. And the aggressive enemy did not give us a moment's respite. Already after returning from the battle in Vela Bay, we could see how critical the situation had become. On October 12th, 349 American shore-based bombers raided Rabaul. Fortunately, the bombing, conducted from high altitude, was not very accurate. Only one transport was sunk, but such a massive raid on the main Japanese naval base shocked the headquarters of the United Fleet on Truk. If the enemy was able to throw such a large number of shore-based aircraft against Rabaul, the Solomon Islands cannot be considered a favorable place for basing and fleet operations. Another massive raid took place on October 18th, when enemy aircraft attacked Rabaul and Buin, our main airbase on Bougainville. 5 days later there was another air raid, which then continued daily until Buin was reduced to a blazing ruin. By this time, Admiral Koga, after some hesitation, had allocated 2 heavy cruisers and a squadron of destroyers to us at Rabaul, which arrived at the base on October 21st. Among the destroyers was the Shiratsui, nominally part of my division and only now coming under my command. Finally, after 6 months after my appointment as division commander, I had 3 ships under my command. Shiratsu was of the same type as Siga and Samedar but differed from them in appearance, resembling the most modern destroyers. In November 1942, she was severely damaged by aerial bombs in the New Guinea area and was virtually rebuilt at Kure. Although my vanity as a division commander was satisfied, my worries were added. Shiratsui was manned by a completely inexperienced crew, and I strongly doubted that this destroyer will add combat power to my division. On October 23rd, I put 3 of my ships to sea, transporting supplies to Iboki about 50 miles east of Cape Gloucester. At dawn, American planes made their, what had become daily, raids on Rabaul and Buin and attacked our division at sea. Fortunately, it was still dark enough to attack such small and nimble targets as the destroyers were, and Shiratsui, dodging bombs, showed much more training than I expected from him. October 27th, the Americans made another landing. This time their target was the small island of Mono, 20 miles south of Bougainville. The next day, American parachutists were dropped on Choiseul, and Admiral Koga realized whether he wanted to or not, a decisive battle was inevitable. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo demanded that Bougainville be held at all costs. Koga immediately ordered Admiral Ozawa's 3 aircraft carriers with 173 planes aboard to move to Rabaul. At the same time, he ordered the formations in Rabaul to destroy the enemy landing force in the vicinity of Bougainville. But the schedule of the Americans did not coincide with the schedule of Admiral Koga. The aircraft carriers Zukaku, Sakaku and Zuiho were still far to the north, when a powerful enemy force under cover of a sweeping rampart of fire from sea and air began an invasion of Cape Torokino on the west coast of central Bougainville. This began at 07:00 hours on November 1st. The enemy landing met almost no resistance. Admiral Kusaka threw all 104 fighter and 16 bombers of his 11th Air Fleet at Torokino, but they were unable to stem the tide of enemy invasion flooding the island. Admiral Ozawa's 3 aircraft carriers, which thought more of their own safety, launched 173 war machines into the air, while still 200 miles north of Rabaul. Admiral Koga, directing the operation from his headquarters on Truk, was trying to avoid the mistakes that had been made 15 months earlier when the Americans landed on Guadalcanal. Then Admiral Mikawa, with his detachment of 7 ships, had won a resplendent victory by sinking 4 enemy cruisers, but he did not destroy a single enemy transport. Therefore, it was now decided to throw all available ships to Torokino, and then hold there a convoy of troops to carry out a counter-surge and destruction of enemy bridgeheads. Koga appointed Rear Admiral Sentaro Omori to command this operation. Admiral Omori, newly arrived at Rabaul, had previously spent many months with his 2 heavy cruisers Mayoko and Haguro, either on Truk or in Japanese waters. Somehow, however, it was expected that in this operation Omori, if not surpassed, then at least repeat the feat of Admiral Mikawa at Guadalcanal. He was required, in addition to the destruction of enemy warships, sink and transports with the landing party. 2 heavy cruisers Admiral Omori had to interact with 2 groups of support ships. The left flank group, consisting of the light cruiser Sendai under Admiral Ijuin's flag, and my 3 destroyers, represented the only formation with any combat experience. The right flank group, commanded by Rear Admiral Hiroshi Matsubara on the light cruiser Agano, had 3 other destroyers, the Naganami, Hatsukaze, and Wakatsuki. These destroyers had never sailed together before, and Matsubara had no experience in night fighting. During a brief meeting in the wardroom of the flagship cruiser Mayoko, Admiral Omori said, "We have never acted together before, and this could be a serious handicap in battle. But Admiral Mikawa's squadron also had no time to prepare beforehand, but achieved brilliant results. I firmly believe in the fighting skill of each ship commander and in the valor of the crews. Therefore, I am convinced that we will win. When I went on deck after the meeting, Admiral Ijuin took me under his arm. "It's going to be a hot one," he said. "I'm relying solely on you, Hara." I laughed. "You'd better grab plenty of anti-shark powder and get ready for a swim." But the Admiral was clearly in no mood for jokes. "I don't like the Sendai cruiser," he said grimly. "It's 9 years old now, and it's awfully clumsy." I knew Ijuin hadn't used the Sendai in months, even though it was the flagship of his 3rd destroyer squadron. The Admiral preferred destroyers. We walked down the gangway to shore in silence. The Admiral gave me his hand and said, "Something is going wrong, Hara. We must fight now and fight desperately, Hara. Japan will collapse if Bougainville falls." Back on the Shiga, I could not escape the thought of why it was Admiral Omori who had been assigned to command this operation. Until recently, he had taught tactics at the mine and torpedo school and had never been involved in a major naval battle. At 15:20 on November 1st, our 10 ships left Rabaul. Immediately after going to sea, we organized ourselves into a marching column. In front went the light cruiser Sendai under the flag Ijuin, leading my destroyers Siga, Sami Dare and Shiratsui. We were coming from the left and just ahead of the heavy cruisers Mayoko and Haguro. To the right of the heavy cruisers, Admiral Matsubara led the light cruiser Agano and destroyers Naganami Hatsukaze and Wakatsuki. Behind us, at a distance of several miles, followed 5 transports full of soldiers and 5 destroyers of their escort. The day was cold and cloudy, and visibility was limited. A faint southeast breeze was blowing, and the sea was calm. Hardly had we left the Saint George Channel when our radios began to pick up numerous radio conversations of the enemy somewhere in the vicinity. We could see no one, but it was becoming clear that an enemy reconnaissance aircraft equipped with radar had detected us while above the cloud layer. Equipped with radar. Wallo? They were transmitting information to Admirals Halsey and Merrill about the movements of Japanese ships in the direction of Empress Augusta Bay. The first report of enemy contact was transmitted when the Japanese ships were 15 miles east of Cape St. George. At 19:45, one of the SB-24 bombers broke through the cloud cover and dropped several bombs on the Sendai, but did not achieve hits. By this time, our scout plane reported the situation in the South 3 battleships, many cruisers and destroyers of the enemy maneuvering in the Bay Empress Augusta near Tarokino. The enemy's forces were much larger than we had anticipated. The Americans were evidently in full readiness, waiting for us. Admiral Omori consulted with headquarters in Rabaul, and at 21:30 Admiral Kusaka ordered the troop transports to turn back. He decided that a counter-landing was impossible with such a concentration of enemy forces, but ordered Omori to follow on and destroy the enemy ships. 10 of our ships continued on through the haze, limiting visibility to 5,000-meter visibility. We were traveling at a speed of 18 knots. Finding the haze gave the enemy the opportunity to use their radars against us with the greatest effectiveness. At 23:24, another SB-24 jumped out of the cloudy darkness and dropped bombs on the heavy cruiser Haguro, but did not achieve hits. After dodging the bombs, the cruiser Haguro catapulted a scout plane, which reported 14 minutes later I see 1 cruiser and 3 enemy destroyers 50 miles on bearing 330 from Cape Mutupina. The indicated location was only 20 miles south of us. Omori ordered the pilot to continue searching for enemy ships and for his ships to temporarily reverse course to gain time while waiting for further reports from the reconnaissance plane. We reversed course for about 10,000 meters and then turned around and again lay on a southerly course. Such maneuvering worked well in 42, when the enemy could only hope to visually detect our ships, and reversing course confused him. In 1943, such methods were already obsolete, because the Americans could keep constant surveillance of us with radar. As we turned to reverse course, we eagerly awaited more reports from our reconnaissance plane. But no reports came. We had no idea that Admiral Merrill's formation of 4 cruisers and 8 destroyers, with full information of our approach, had already rushed north to intercept our formation on approach. At 25, I saw in the distance a dim red missile hanging in the night sky. The bearing on this missile was 70 degrees off the port bow, and roughly matched the direction of the location of the enemy force reported by the scout plane of the heavy cruiser Hagoro. The missile looked so dim that I estimated its distance to be 20,000 meters. After staying in the sky for 2 or 3 seconds, the missile disappeared. I continued to stare at the rocket as if mesmerized, and then at the spot in the sky where it went out, wasting precious time and ignoring other important factors. That was my mistake. Had I looked around at that moment, I would have seen that, as a result of the complicated maneuvers and turns that had just been completed, our formation had fallen into the most perfect disarray. Moreover, all the ships appeared dangerously crowded together. Samudar was out of formation to my left, and our other 3 ships were close together at 300 meters instead of the prescribed 500 meters. I decided that the missile must have been dropped by our reconnaissance plane to mark the enemy's position, and so I transmitted an urgent message to all the ships. I see the enemy on bearing 70 port side. No one in our formation could even imagine that the main forces of the enemy were approaching us from the south, and were right on our course at that moment. At that moment, my signalman reported, on the port side on bearing 74 ships it was 45 on November 2nd, 1943. I believed that these 4 ships had appeared continuing on their course from the spot indicated by the missile. In reality, while I was staring at that missile, 4 of the 8 American destroyers coming from south to north had dodged off course to turn around and fire torpedoes. My signalman continued to report, the enemy detachment has split into 2 groups. One group is moving away, the second group is lying on a parallel course with us. They are destroyers, distance 7,000 meters. I shuddered at the realization that the departing destroyers had already released their torpedoes. The enemy had managed to seize the initiative. I immediately ordered to put the rudder to starboard and release the torpedoes. Sigurd began to turn right, releasing at 2-second intervals 8 torpedoes. I watched the situation, fully confident that I would be able to dodge any torpedoes fired by the Americans. Turning around to follow the progress of my own torpedoes, I was horrified to see that the cruiser Sendai was coming straight at my destroyer at full speed. Simultaneously with Shiga cruiser also turned to the right, but performed this maneuver much faster and steeper. I was dumbfounded, seeing at what speed the cruiser is approaching Siga. Its huge hull, 3 times our size, was torpedoing right into the middle of our starboard side. "Starboard," I yelled, "full ahead." Like a drowning man in the abyss, I held my breath as I saw the cruiser's huge bow looming over the Siga. It seemed to me that the Siga was crawling like a snail, and I was tense in anticipation of the inevitable collision, when the Siga wagged its fragile stern and swept less than 3 meters from the cruiser. Taking a breath from the danger that had passed, I cast a wary glance in the direction of the Samudar and froze again in horror. Samudar, dodging sharply to the right of the distraught Sendai, had streaked the entire port side and deck of the Saratsui, with her broadside smashing and crushing all her guns and torpedo apparatus. But all my astonishment was just beginning. No sooner had I recovered from the collision of my 2 destroyers than the Sendai, without any warning, turned around again and rushed to the opposite column of our ships. Stunned by this behavior of his flagship cruiser, Admiral Ijuin ordered the rudder to be shifted, and watched as the cruiser suddenly forked to the left, performing some incomprehensible maneuver. The next moment I was horrified to see the water columns from the fallen shells rise up around the Sendai, and one of them struck right into the middle of the cruiser. Trotting like a drunken man, the Sendai came under the first salvo of the American cruisers. I have never seen such exceptional accuracy, the first salvo, and a direct hit. The second and third salvos also struck the doomed cruiser, and it burst into flames like a giant torch. The ship shuddered, tilted and slowed down, but still managed to fire 8 of its torpedoes in the general direction of the enemy ships. From the destroyer Samidar, 500 meters further away, they managed to calculate the location of the American ships, and at 52, Captain third-rank Sujihara fired a fan of 8 torpedoes. The 4 invisible American cruisers were 15,000 meters away from us. At 51, they made a successive right turn and successfully evaded 16 torpedoes. A hit due to an error in maneuvering received only the last ship in the second American column, destroyer Foote. He was put out of action, but did not sink. Meanwhile, chaos and panic reigned in the other 2 columns of our ships. At 45, when I signaled the detection of enemy ships, Admiral Amori could not see them. But 5 minutes later he saw the Sendai erupt under a hail of American shells. The Admiral thought the Sendai was about 1,000 meters ahead of him on a course parallel to that of the heavy cruiser Miyoko. Instead, he discovered the burning Sendai off his left bow. Deciding to reorganize the formation back into its original order, the Admiral ordered all ships to lie down on a reverse course to get out of the firing zone. This maneuver could have succeeded if all the ships had clearly executed it. But on many ships' officers had no experience of night fighting, and the result of this command was total chaos. Added to it were the mistakes made by Admiral Matsubara's third column. Matsubara, who had little combat experience, was, however, known for his fanatical aggressiveness. Having received my message about the appearance of the enemy, he immediately threw his column to attack the American ships. Having developed full speed, his ships for 10 minutes went in complete darkness in the direction indicated, seeing nothing. Then Matsubara saw the heavy cruisers Miyoko and Haguro begin to turn. He began to do the same, making the most serious mistake of the night. When his cruiser Agano and the 3 destroyers following her, having completed the turn, took a course to the north, Matsubara did not notice that his column at right angles crossed the course of Admiral Amori's heavy cruisers. As a result, the heavy cruiser Miyoko crashed into the destroyer Hatsukaze, and the heavy cruiser Haguro narrowly avoided collision with Wakatsuki. In panic, Matsubara again turned around to return to his damaged destroyer, but since in the heat of battle he could not help the damaged ship, Matsubara again ordered his column to lie on a parallel course with the heavy cruisers. At 1:15, American shells struck the Miyoko and Haguro. The heavy cruisers blindly returned fire in the likely direction of the enemy's location. In the next few minutes, continuing to fire from the main caliber guns, heavy cruisers also fired 24 torpedoes, none of which hit the target. American radars deprived the Japanese fleet of the former advantage in night fighting. American destroyers achieved excellent results, although all 10 of their torpedoes passed by. In one blow, 3 Japanese ships were disabled. At this time, the signalman reported that from the stern of the Sendai a distress signal was being transmitted by signal lantern, asking the Sigga to approach the cruiser. My destroyer was 500 meters from the starboard side of Sendai. The enemy shells did not reach us, continuing to cascade down on the stricken cruiser. My best friend, Admiral Ijuin, was calling for my help, but the Sigga had no chance of surviving if it came close to the burning Sendai. I still remembered that 43 men on the Amatsukaze had lost their lives after coming under the concentrated fire of the cruiser Helena, because of their own mistake. For the sake of those sailors' souls, I had no right to repeat such a mistake. The commander of the Shiga, with a note of impatience in his voice, asked for permission to approach the Sendai. I did not authorize it. But that's an order from the squadron commander. Yamagami shouted. "He's ordering us to approach the cruiser and remove the crew." "No, Yamagami," I replied firmly. "I have decided not to do that. Look what's being done around the cruiser. We may be able to take off a couple of people, but we'll all die and destroy the destroyer." "But we have our orders." Yamagami wouldn't stop. "Orders?" I questioned. "Yes, we have orders, and let's follow them. We have orders to fight the enemy. There is a battle going on, and during the battle all rescue operations are secondary." "But our comrades are dying out there, Captain First Rank Hara," Yamagami screamed hysterically. "They're dying in front of your eyes and asking for help." That made me angry, and I yelled back, "Shut up. Mind your own business. As long as I'm in charge." Yamagami fell silent in a daze, and I gave the command, "Left rudder. Full ahead. We're attacking." Shiga's turbines roared, bringing her speed to a maximum of 30 knots. I wanted to join the other ships and organize together to search and attack the enemy ships. But I saw no one, and no one noticed me. I spent the next 10 minutes desperately searching for targets. I continued on a southerly course until 1:34, when Admiral Omori's order was received to withdraw from the battle site and return to Rabaul. Omori decided to withdraw from the battle as he concluded that we were opposed by 7 enemy cruisers and 9 destroyers operating in 2 Kielvator columns. To this conclusion, the Admiral came to on the basis of erroneous reports from reconnaissance planes. Thanks to this, our 2 heavy cruisers all night fought a mirage that existed only in the mind of the commander. In reality, 4 American cruisers at 1:01, which were heading south, turned north. This gave Omori the illusion that 1 enemy cruiser had been sunk definitely, and the other 2 had been damaged. He never realized that his cruisers were acting like 2 blind men, wasting ammunition and fuel. There was a heavy silence on the bridge of the Siga when we returned to base. I thought that we were still lucky. If the Americans had acted more actively, they could have sunk all our ships in such chaos. At 8 p.m. on November 2nd, we returned to Rabaul. We were anchoring when the Miyako semaphore reported submarine J-104 reported that rescued from the Sendai Admiral Iwin and 37 crew members. No one could be rescued from the destroyer Hatsukaz. The next morning, Captain 3rd Rank Yamagami offered to go to the Miyako and submit a full report to Admiral Omori on the events of the previous night. I advised him to do this later, and in the meantime, to prepare the ship to repel the air raid. The Americans had been bombing Rabaul more and more frequently and intensively lately. I had a premonition that there would be an air raid today, and I was not mistaken. The enemy planes appeared from the north, streaking over the water at a height of no more than 50 meters. Previous bombing raids had been carried out from higher altitudes, but today the tactics had changed. The battle that began left me with one of the most vivid memories of the war. Siga was the first ship to give way as the American bombers appeared. The Samidar and Shiratsui followed. All the guns were cocked skyward, and their crews worked like furious devils, firing incessantly. It seemed that all the anger generated by the unsuccessful outcome of the battle in Empress Augusta Bay was put into this fire. On this day, 80 American B-25 bombers and 80 P-38 fighters participated in the raid on Rabaul. Most of them glided right over the masts of my destroyers. Bombardiers of American planes apparently did not realize what these little ships were spinning under them and did not particularly want to waste bombs on us. Only a few bombs were dropped, one of which slightly damaged the Saratsu. But our guns were firing in such a way that the formation of enemy planes immediately dispersed as they flew over us. In the end, the Americans achieved results completely disproportionate to their numbers. 18 Japanese planes were destroyed, and only 2 merchant ships and 1 submarine hunter were sunk. For these paltry results, the Americans paid with 8 bombers and 9 fighters that were definitely shot down. In addition, many planes were so damaged that they crashed on landing after wobbling to the base. Usually, anti-aircraft fire from surface ships on aircraft is not particularly effective, but this day it was different. The enemy planes themselves were coming into the solid wall of our anti-aircraft fire. I myself saw at least 5 machines shot down by the Sigurd guns. When my destroyers returned to their anchorages, I was pleased to notice that the decadent mood engendered by last night's fighting had disappeared. Officers and sailors were once again joking and laughing. After lunch, I went to the flagship cruiser Mayoko with a report on yesterday's battle. After repelling the air raid, it was easier for me to talk about the unpleasant events of the previous night. Admiral Omori met me, as usual, warm and friendly. After listening to my report, he, sensing my nervousness, soothingly said, "I believe you did everything right, and the fact that you stayed away from the Sendai when it was under concentrated fire is also correct. In addition, I especially thank you for your report at 45 of enemy sightings. No one else noticed the American ships. Had it not been for that message, there is no telling how things would have ended for our entire unit." I asked permission to go and was on my way to the door when the Admiral ordered me back. He pulled his wallet out of his pocket and dumped its contents on the table. "There's 30 yen in here," he smirked. "It's not much, but take it as my contribution to buy drinks for your sailors." I must have looked very confused, because the Admiral laughed loudly. Then we shook hands and laughed together. Apparently, the story of the episode of returning the sword to get money for drinks for the sailors had reached him, although this episode had occurred long before the Admiral arrived in Rabaul. In the battle in Empress Augusta Bay, the Americans won a convincing victory. Their destroyer Foot, although severely damaged by a torpedo from the Samudar, managed to return to base. Manpower losses amounted to less than 40 men killed and wounded. Japanese losses were much greater. On the sunken cruiser Sendai died 335 people. The destroyer Hatsukaze perished with her entire crew of 240 men. Direct hits on the heavy cruisers Mayoko and Hagoro caused some damage to those ships, killing 6 more men and wounding 7 others. Omori was soon removed from command and appointed chief of the mine and torpedo school. Matsubara, who was transferred to a shore post, was also removed from his post. On November 3rd, the submarine J-104 came to Rabaul with those rescued from the cruiser Sendai. It was pitiful to watch Admiral Ijuin as he walked down to the dock. I approached him apologizing for not being able to approach the Sendai at his request. He hugged me. "You have nothing to apologize for, Hara. I had no right to give such an order. It was the order of a coward." Soon Admiral Ijuin was recalled to Tokyo. After several months of rest, he returned to the South Pacific and fought valiantly. Ijuin lost his life on May 24, 1944, when, while performing convoy escort duty, his flagship frigate Iki was sunk by the U.S. submarine Rayton